Imagine waking up to a bright morning, your children playing outside, the hum of distant machinery filling the air. Life feels ordinary, safe. But in the shadows of that normal day, something invisible begins to spread. Something deadly. No alarms sound, no sirens blare, and yet, thousands of lives are already at risk. You just don't know it yet. Because what if I told you there was a nuclear disaster more devastating than Chernobyl, and yet, the world hardly knows it happened. It wasn't Ukraine. It wasn't Fukushima. It was somewhere most people would never expect. Hidden deep within the vast forests and icy winds of the Soviet Union, a place called Kyshchtym, and the event? The 1957 Mayak nuclear disaster. But why don't we talk about it? That's the question. And the answer will leave you stunned. Before we dive into what happened, let's step back. To understand this forgotten catastrophe, we need to understand the world that created it. It was the dawn of the Cold War. The nuclear arms race was heating up. America had already shocked the planet by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union, desperate to catch up, launched a crash program to build its own nuclear arsenal. The pressure was immense. The consequences of failure, unthinkable, and so corners were cut. In 1945, the Soviet government founded Mayak, a secret nuclear complex located near the small town of Kyshchtym, deep in the Ural Mountains. The location was remote, far from prying eyes. Thousands of workers, many of them prisoners or forced laborers, were rushed in to build the facility. Mayak wasn't just a reactor. It was a full-scale nuclear production site. Reactors, reprocessing plants, waste facilities, all operating in a tightly controlled military zone. Maps didn't show it. The public didn't know it existed. It was as if Mayak had been erased from reality. But inside, the work was all too real, and all too dangerous. Radiation safety, barely a concern. Monitoring systems, primitive at best. Waste management, non-existent. Liquid radioactive waste was dumped directly into the nearby Teka River, poisoning countless villagers downstream. Entire communities began falling ill, skin lesions, birth defects, cancers. But no one spoke up. No one dared. You see, in the Soviet Union, secrecy was a weapon. Whistleblowers vanished. Journalists were silenced. Even doctors were forbidden from diagnosing radiation sickness. Instead, they were instructed to write vague reports, general weakness, unidentified fever, or the chillingly euphemistic special disease number 4. And then, in 1957, the inevitable happened. At Mayak, highly radioactive liquid waste was stored in underground tanks cooled by a fragile ventilation system. One of those tanks, containing over 70 tons of nuclear waste, silently overheated. For months, unnoticed, the cooling system had failed. And on September 29th, the tank exploded. The blast was massive, equivalent to about 75 tons of TNT. It tore through the earth, launching a radioactive plume more than a kilometer into the sky. The mushroom cloud drifted northeast, carried by the wind, depositing deadly isotopes across 20,000 square kilometers. This radioactive belt, now known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace, EURT, contaminated more than 200 towns and villages. Over 270,000 people lived in the affected zone, and not a single one of them was warned. No evacuation orders, no public alerts, nothing. Instead, the Soviet regime locked down all information. Soldiers moved in quietly. Entire villages were erased, literally bulldozed off the map. Survivors were told to remain silent. Doctors were instructed to misdiagnose patients. And all official records of the explosion, classified. For the outside world, it was as if nothing had happened. But inside the zone, life became a slow-motion nightmare. Residents began suffering from nausea, vomiting, severe burns, signs of acute radiation poisoning. Children lost their hair. Mothers miscarried. Animals died where they stood. But still, there were no answers. The government called it a chemical accident. Those who asked too many questions were arrested or made to disappear. And here's the most haunting part. Many of the victims didn't even know what had happened until decades later. Why? Because in the USSR, image mattered more than lives. Admitting to a nuclear disaster would have been a global embarrassment. Proof that the Soviet nuclear program was reckless, dangerous, and out of control. Instead, they buried the truth under layers of denial, propaganda, and fear. And while Mayak's disaster unfolded in silence, another truth was emerging. One even more disturbing. This wasn't Mayak's first sin. Years before the explosion, radioactive waste had already poisoned thousands through the Teka River. In some villages, the rate of leukemia was 41 times higher than average. Cancers, deformities, neurological disorders, these were common. And yet, people were told the water was safe. In one harrowing account, a woman named Galina, then a child, remembered how she used to play in the river, catching fish with her bare hands. By the time she was 16, she had undergone multiple surgeries for tumors. Her sister had died at 14. Her father, a fisherman, collapsed suddenly at work and never regained consciousness. Galina never knew the cause, not until decades later, when formerly classified documents began to leak. But by then, it was too late. Now, let's pause for a second. We all know Chernobyl. We've seen the images. The Pripyat Ferris wheel. The firemen on the roof. The haunting stories of those who gave their lives to prevent a global catastrophe. Chernobyl is burned into our collective memory. So why doesn't anyone talk about KYSHTYM? The answer is as unsettling as the disaster itself. KYSHTYM wasn't just hidden. It was intentionally erased. Even the name is misleading. The explosion occurred near the town of Ozyorsk, but because that city didn't officially exist, the Soviet regime listed KYSHTYM, a smaller, unrelated town, as the site of the disaster. It was misdirection on a national scale. And it worked. For nearly 30 years, the world had no idea. It wasn't until 1976, when Soviet dissident and nuclear physicist Dr. Boris Medvedev smuggled information to the West, that the truth began to emerge. Western scientists were stunned. Some didn't believe it. Others dismissed it as Cold War propaganda. But then came the satellite images, radiation anomalies, scorched landscapes, strange patterns across the Urals. And the evidence could no longer be denied. So here's the chilling truth. The Mayak disaster released twice as much long-lived radioactive material as Chernobyl. It contaminated a population 10 times larger. And unlike Chernobyl, which triggered a massive international response, Mayak was met with silence. The people suffered in the dark, and the world simply moved on. But the story isn't over, because what happened after the explosion might be even worse than the disaster itself. How the Soviet Union conducted secret experiments on exposed populations. How survivors were tracked, studied, and manipulated. And how today Mayak still operates. Still reprocessing nuclear fuel, still producing waste, and still hiding behind a wall of secrecy. But we'll get there, because in the next chapter we dive into the cover-up operation, the terrifying aftermath for the people on the ground, and the global ramifications that could have changed history, if only someone had been listening. The mushroom cloud had already dispersed, settling a toxic trail of cesium-137 and strontium-90 across thousands of square kilometers. Villagers walked unknowingly through radioactive fields, children played in dust that could kill them, and livestock grazed on poisoned grass. But the true horror hadn't even begun. Not yet. Because now came the most ruthless part of the story, the cover-up. Within hours of the explosion, high-ranking officials from the Soviet Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the body responsible for nuclear weapons development, were dispatched to the Mayak facility. They didn't come to help the victims. They came to control the narrative. They called it the incident. Never a disaster. Never radiation. Never nuclear. The first order of business? Silence. Dozens of military trucks rolled into the contamination zone. Their mission? Not to rescue the locals, but to remove them without questions, without answers, and without trace. Entire villages were loaded onto buses in the dead of night and transported to unknown locations. No one told them why. No one told them where. And when the bulldozers came the next day to flatten their homes, to quite literally erase them from existence, no explanation was offered. The ground, now glowing with radioactive fallout, was simply marked as closed territory, and any surviving evidence was locked behind military gates. But the silence didn't stop there. In the hospitals, a different kind of cover-up was underway. Doctors treating patients with classic symptoms of radiation poisoning were forbidden from writing the true cause in medical records. Instead, the directive came from above: record only vague diagnoses. Flu-like symptoms, fatigue, unspecified infection. Some doctors resisted, and they paid for it, silenced, relocated, or worse. A few brave ones kept secret records, hoping that someday the truth would come to light. But many complied out of fear for their lives. In one chilling case, a physician named Dr. Antonov attempted to document the increasing radiation burns among his patients in the village of Tatarskaya Karabalka. His notes were discovered by the KGB. He disappeared within a week. His files were seized. His name never spoken again. The people in the region, confused and afraid, began referring to the mysterious sickness as the invisible death. It struck without warning. It made your skin peel, your teeth fall out, your body waste away, but no one would tell them why. And all the while, the state-controlled media remained silent. Not a single newspaper mentioned the explosion. Radio broadcasts continued with cheerful propaganda. Citizens were fed stories of Soviet scientific triumph, of peaceful nuclear progress, while the very soil beneath them was dying. But covering up a disaster of this scale wasn't easy. Radiation doesn't follow borders. It doesn't obey ideology. The radioactive plume drifted far beyond the exclusion zone. Poisoned forests, rivers, crops. It left scars on the land so severe that birds stopped nesting, plants withered, and animals died en masse. Eventually, Soviet scientists realized that they needed to monitor the long-term effects, not to warn the public, but to gather data. And that's when the cover-up took an even darker turn. The Soviet regime transformed the disaster zone into a giant, secret human laboratory. They created something called the KYSHTYM study, a long-term program to observe the health effects of radiation on exposed populations. Without informed consent, without medical support, and without basic human decency, they monitored the suffering like scientists studying lab rats. Entire families were tracked. Blood samples were collected. Illnesses were documented but not treated. In many cases, patients were deliberately left untreated so researchers could observe natural progression of radiation-induced diseases. All of this was hidden under thick layers of classification. The existence of the KYSHTYM study wasn't even acknowledged until the 1990s, when Soviet archives began to crack open. But by then, thousands had already suffered, abandoned, unacknowledged, and used as data points in a horrific state experiment. But let's shift for a moment to the international front. You might wonder, how did the rest of the world not notice? Well, some did. In the late 1950s and early 60s, scientists in Scandinavia began noticing strange upticks in atmospheric radiation levels, patterns that couldn't be explained by nuclear tests in the Pacific or by Western reactors. The isotopic fingerprints pointed east, toward the Urals. American intelligence, too, suspected something. Aerial reconnaissance missions picked up unusual heat signatures and abnormal deforestation patterns in the region around Mayak. But the Cold War was in full swing, and rather than raise alarm, the US chose to remain silent. Why? Because calling out the Soviets for a nuclear disaster would invite scrutiny of America's own nuclear testing programs, especially those in Nevada and the Pacific Islands, which had also caused widespread environmental and human damage. So, just like the USSR, the West turned a blind eye. The victims of Mayak were forgotten not only by their own government, but by the world. Still, whispers of the truth began to escape. In 1976, Soviet biologist Boris Medvedev, exiled in the UK, published an article outlining evidence of a major radioactive disaster in the Soviet Union. He didn't have the full picture, but he had enough clues to draw a chilling sketch. Western scientists were skeptical. Without hard data, the claims seemed too outrageous to believe. A nuclear disaster worse than Chernobyl, and no one knew about it? It wasn't until the late 1980s, after the Chernobyl explosion forced the Soviet regime into limited transparency, that foreign researchers were finally granted restricted access to some of the contaminated zones around Mayak. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The land was poisoned, the water undrinkable, cancer rates had soared, generations had been damaged, and still no formal recognition from the Russian government. No national day of mourning, no compensation for the families, no apologies. The disaster was buried under red tape, denial, and decades of bureaucratic silence. But perhaps the most haunting part of the cover-up lies not in the data or in the radioactive trace, but in the faces of the survivors. People like Yelena, who lived in a village just 15 kilometers from the blast zone. She was 12 at the time of the explosion. She remembers the strange metallic taste in the air, the sudden evacuation, the military trucks, the silence. Years later, she lost both her parents to cancer. Her younger brother was born with severe deformities. Her own body bears the marks of the radiation, chronic illnesses, multiple tumors, internal scarring. When she finally discovered the truth, she felt no relief, just rage. "They used us," she once said in an interview. "We were like insects to them. They watched us suffer, and they wrote it down in notebooks." Her story is just one of thousands, hidden, ignored, and erased. And here's the twisted irony. While the world wept for Chernobyl, and rightly so, the victims of Mayak were never given that dignity. There are no famous documentaries, no global memorials, no dramatized HBO miniseries, just empty land, poisoned rivers, and fading voices. But what if I told you? The danger isn't over, because Mayak is still active. Yes, even today, the facility continues to reprocess spent nuclear fuel from across Russia and even from foreign countries. It operates behind heavy security and tight-lipped bureaucracy. Activists and journalists who try to investigate are harassed, surveilled, and sometimes arrested. Leaks have been reported. In 2017, a mysterious radioactive cloud, ruthenium-106, was detected over Europe. Independent researchers traced the origin to, you guessed it, Mayak. Once again, Russian officials denied everything. Once again, the world moved on. And once again, the people living nearby were left in the dark. In the next block, we'll journey deeper into the long-term consequences. How this invisible legacy has shaped generations, how entire regions became ghost zones, and how the people are still fighting, not just for justice but for recognition. We'll also confront a chilling possibility. Could a disaster like this happen again? And if so, would anyone tell us the truth? Decades have passed since that silent explosion shook the earth beneath Mayak. The ashes have settled. The reports were buried. But the land still remembers. Across the East Ural radioactive trace, nature has changed. Forests grow thick and quiet, but not with life. Some trees bear scars, gnarled bark, twisted limbs, mutated by exposure to radiation. In places, the soil still hums with gamma rays, and Geiger counters scream into the wind. This is no ordinary wilderness. This is a ghost zone, an unmarked graveyard for tens of thousands of lives touched, damaged, or destroyed by a disaster that was never supposed to exist. And yet, people still live here. Meet Victor, a man born in the 1960s in the contaminated zone, raised just a few kilometers from the blast site. As a child, he remembers swimming in the river, drinking from the well, walking through the woods, never realizing he was soaking in radiation. "I was always sick," he says, "as far back as I can remember." By his mid-30s, Victor had developed a rare form of thyroid cancer. By 40, he'd lost his wife, also a victim of cancer. 2 of his children were born with severe developmental disorders. The doctors were careful not to mention radiation. No one wanted to lose their job, or worse. But Victor found old military maps. He learned that his village, Metlino, had been one of the first settlements evacuated after the Mayak explosion. And yet, after a brief cleanup, it was quietly resettled, without informing the people of its radioactive legacy. No one told us. They just told us the land was fine, that it had healed. But it hadn't, and it still hasn't. Radiation isn't like fire or flood. It doesn't roar in. It doesn't knock down buildings. It lingers, unseen, untouched, but deadly. It settles into the bones, the blood, the DNA. That's what makes the aftermath of Mayak so uniquely cruel. Because the disaster wasn't just a single event. It was, and still is, a slow-motion catastrophe. Generations were born into it. Entire family trees poisoned at the root. And the tragedy goes deeper than illness or death. It's the loss of trust, the rupture of identity, the psychological trauma of being erased from history. Imagine growing up in a place that doesn't officially exist, suffering from a disease no one will name, living on land marked clean by a government that knows it's not. This is the reality for survivors of KYSHTYM. And for many, it's a life sentence. But it gets worse. In the decades following the disaster, thousands of families were compensated with lies. The Soviet and later Russian government set up relocation zones, but these were often near other contaminated areas. Many victims were never properly evacuated, and some who were moved ended up in places equally toxic. Official acknowledgement of the Mayak disaster didn't come until the 1990s, and even then, it was partial and heavily censored. In 1992, a Russian parliamentary commission finally confirmed that an explosion occurred in 1957 at the Mayak facility, releasing significant amounts of radioactive materials. But the report stopped short of naming victims, assigning blame, or offering full transparency. Why? Because the Mayak complex was still vital to the Russian nuclear program. And it still is. Today, Mayak operates as the federal state unitary enterprise, Mayak Production Association. It provides nuclear fuel reprocessing services for Russia and international clients. Its role is critical in the management of spent nuclear fuel, a politically and economically sensitive operation. In other words, Mayak is too important to fail, so the truth remains tightly controlled. Environmental activists attempting to access data about emissions are blocked by legal walls. Independent scientists requesting access to radiation readings are denied under national security concerns. And residents who speak out often face intimidation or worse. One environmental researcher, Nadezhda Kutapova, spent years documenting the health effects on nearby populations. Her NGO, Planet of Hopes, provided legal support for radiation victims. In 2015, she was labeled a foreign agent and forced into exile after receiving threats from state media. "This is how the system works," she said in an interview from Paris. "They don't just hide the past. They punish anyone who tries to expose the present." So what happens to the people still living in this invisible zone? They become statistics. According to multiple health surveys conducted by independent organizations in the 2000s and 2010s, communities in the Chelyabinsk Oblast, particularly around the Teka River Basin, show unusually high rates of cancer, birth defects, and genetic mutations. But official Russian health data often omits these trends. Instead, the Ministry of Health reports normal levels of disease and mortality. Any contradictions are explained away as poor diet, lifestyle choices, or data errors. And when foreign journalists report otherwise, Russian state media responds with denial and counter-accusations, painting critics as liars, spies, or agents of Western propaganda. The result? A collective gaslighting of an entire region. But even within that darkness, some fight to be seen. In 2018, a group of survivors and activists created a digital memorial project titled Invisible Towns. It uses satellite images, personal testimonies, and declassified documents to reconstruct the erased villages along the East Ural radioactive trace. You can zoom in and find names of settlements that no longer appear on maps. Ikulovo, Masliamovo, Ibragimovo, Zarikny, each with its own story, each a casualty of a silent war. It's a haunting reminder that these weren't just places. They were homes, with laughter, with weddings, with birthdays, and now with nothing. Let's pause here and ask a deeper question. Why does this matter today? Because the mechanisms that allowed KYSHTYM to happen are not gone. They're still active. In authoritarian regimes, in weak democracies, in corporations that prioritize profit over safety, in institutions that mistake silence for control. And because nuclear disasters don't recognize borders, politics, or time. Think about it. Chernobyl burned for 10 days. Fukushima melted over the course of hours. But Mayak? Mayak has been bleeding poison into the land and its people for nearly 80 years. And it's still not over. Take the Teka River, for example. Used from 1949 to 1956 as a dumping ground for high-level nuclear waste. The river remains dangerously contaminated to this day. Attempts have been made to divert its flow, reinforce its banks, and prevent human access. But locals still rely on it for fishing, farming, and drinking. In 2007, researchers from Greenpeace and Bologna documented cesium and strontium levels dozens of times higher than international safety limits in sediment samples. And yet, the official line remains. The area is safe. This isn't just about the past. It's about what we're willing to accept today. What happens when governments bury catastrophes? When victims are denied their pain? When accountability is replaced by silence? The Mayak disaster is a warning, etched in bone, in blood, in scorched land. And it challenges us with a choice: to look away as generations did before, or to face the truth no matter how long it was hidden. Because the cost of forgetting is always paid by someone else. In the next block, we'll explore how this disaster was finally exposed to the world. We'll meet the whistleblowers, the scientists who risked everything, and uncover the stunning parallels between KYSHTYM, Chernobyl, and modern nuclear risks. And we'll ask the question no one dares to say out loud: could this happen again in our lifetime? For decades, the Mayak disaster remained sealed behind steel doors and military silence. But secrets that toxic don't stay buried forever. The first cracks in the wall came from within, from brave men and women who chose truth over loyalty, risking their careers, their freedom, and sometimes their lives, to expose a catastrophe the world wasn't supposed to know about. These were the whistleblowers, the voices that refused to stay silent. And their stories are as haunting as the disaster itself. The most famous of these early truth-tellers was Dr. Boris Medvedev, a Soviet biologist and geneticist who, by the 1970s, had already been expelled from his scientific position and stripped of his privileges for criticizing Soviet censorship. From exile in the UK, Medvedev began piecing together something disturbing. Drawing from fragmented reports, émigré testimonies, and subtle hints in Soviet medical literature, he proposed something unthinkable: that a massive nuclear disaster had occurred in the Soviet Union, and no one knew about it. In 1976, he published an article in New Scientist detailing a nuclear accident of unprecedented scale in the southern Urals, possibly as early as the 1950s. His evidence was circumstantial. He had no satellite images, no declassified files, just whispers, patterns, and buried truths. And yet, he was right. Medvedev's claims sent shockwaves through Western scientific circles. Some dismissed him as paranoid. Others accused him of Cold War sensationalism. But one man listened carefully: Leo Tummerman, a physicist working in Sweden who had defected years earlier. He recognized the radioactive isotopes described in Medvedev's article. He had worked on similar projects at a sister facility in Russia. Then came the breakthrough. U.S. intelligence agencies, prompted by the article, began reviewing decades of satellite reconnaissance data. They found thermal anomalies, signs of massive Earth disturbances, and abnormally scorched terrain in the vicinity of the Mayak complex, corroborating Medvedev's theory. Still, the CIA chose not to publicize the findings. Why? Because exposing a Soviet nuclear disaster might force the U.S. to explain its own history of nuclear testing fallout, especially the Marshall Islands, where thousands of native islanders had been unknowingly exposed to radioactive fallout during Operation Castle. So the intelligence stayed buried. Meanwhile, Medvedev was attacked in Soviet press as a traitor. His Soviet citizenship was revoked. His family faced threats. His books were banned. But he had lit the spark, and others would follow. In the 1980s, a second wave of Soviet scientists, emboldened by Gorbachev's glasnost reforms, began cautiously speaking out. One of them was Dr. Lev Tummerman's cousin, Natalia, an epidemiologist working in the Chelyabinsk region. She had quietly been tracking cancer clusters and genetic anomalies in the region for over a decade, noticing disturbing patterns. children born with fused limbs, teenagers developing thyroid tumors, women experiencing mass miscarriages. When she requested access to historical radiation data, her clearance was denied. So she began collecting oral histories. Survivors told her about strange illnesses, military evacuations, and entire villages disappearing without explanation. Eventually, she assembled a secret report, documenting radiation levels, illness patterns, and evidence that the region had suffered multiple nuclear incidents, not just one. She submitted her findings to the Ministry of Health. 2 months later, her office was raided. Her documents were seized. She was reassigned to an unrelated department in Siberia. Her research destroyed. Still, copies of her report had already been smuggled to foreign NGOs through underground networks. The truth was no longer just a rumor. It was growing teeth. But the real moment of reckoning came after Chernobyl. In 1986, when reactor number 4 exploded in Pripyat, the Soviet government could no longer maintain the illusion of perfect control. The scale of that disaster forced a temporary opening of the regime's Iron Curtain. And suddenly, researchers began revisiting old rumors. International scientists were finally allowed into Chelyabinsk Oblast, though only under strict supervision. What they found confirmed the worst. The region bore the radioactive scars of not just one disaster, but many. The 1957 explosion, the Teka River contamination from 1949 onward, and a third lesser-known incident in 1967, when dried radioactive sediments from Lake Karachay were picked up by a windstorm and spread across another swath of populated land. It was a trilogy of terror. 1 facility, 3 catastrophes, hundreds of thousands affected, and yet, there was still no justice. The Russian Federation, now the legal successor to the Soviet Union, acknowledged the disaster but did not apologize. Nor did it provide comprehensive compensation to victims. Some survivors received minor health pensions. Others were given medals for service to the state. But there was no national inquiry, no mass memorial, no full-scale medical response. Instead, the government focused on damage control. In 1993, a heavily redacted version of the KYSHTYM incident report was released to the public. It downplayed the severity, avoided assigning blame, and claimed that no significant population loss had occurred as a result of the explosion. This, despite independent estimates suggesting that tens of thousands had died prematurely from radiation-related illnesses since 1957. And the most chilling part? Mayak was still running. By the 2000s, Mayak had shifted into a new phase of its operations, reprocessing nuclear fuel for international clients, including European countries. Yes, you read that right. The same facility that caused one of the worst nuclear disasters in history now handles spent fuel from other nations. Greenpeace, Bologna, and other watchdogs began raising alarms. They pointed to continued leaks, mysterious radiation spikes, and a 2003 incident in which a tank of liquid nuclear waste almost exploded again due to pressure buildup. The only reason it didn't? A technician noticed a faulty gauge during a routine check and sounded the alarm. No one died that time. But it was a stark reminder. Mayak remains a ticking time bomb. So the question now becomes, could it happen again? Let's be brutally honest. The factors that made Mayak dangerous are not relics of the past. They exist right now in nuclear facilities around the world. Underfunded safety protocols. Governments that prioritize secrecy over transparency. Populations that live near reactors but have no idea what could go wrong. A global industry that treats nuclear waste as someone else's problem. In 2017, as mentioned earlier, Europe detected a mysterious cloud of ruthenium-106, a radioactive isotope that doesn't occur naturally. It was harmless at the detected levels, but its presence indicated a serious leak somewhere in Eastern Europe or Russia. Independent researchers traced it back to, yes, Mayak. Russian officials denied any incident had occurred. No facility claimed responsibility, and the cloud drifted away. It's the same pattern over and over. Silence, denial, dismissal, disappearance. And that's the lesson of Mayak. It's not just a story of radioactive contamination. It's a story of what happens when systems choose secrecy over safety. when scientists are told to lie, when victims are told to suffer quietly, when governments gamble with human lives. Mayak teaches us that the most dangerous part of a nuclear disaster may not be the radiation. It may be the silence that follows. But amidst the darkness, there's one final thread of hope: the storytellers. From Medvedev to Natalia Tumerman, from exiled activists to citizen journalists, from grieving survivors to persistent scientists, the truth lived because someone chose to speak. Even when no one listened, even when they were punished, even when it seemed hopeless. And now, through this video, you're hearing it too. You're part of the chain that keeps memory alive, that demands accountability, that refuses to let the forgotten remain forgotten. In our final block, we'll step back and ask, what now? What can we learn from KYSHTYM? What should every citizen, every government, every industry take from the ashes of Mayak? And how can we prevent the next disaster before it happens? What good is remembering a disaster if it teaches us nothing? The Mayak nuclear catastrophe, hidden in the shadows of secrecy, denied by those in power, and almost wiped from history, demands more than just a passing glance. It demands reflection. It demands action. Because this wasn't just a Soviet tragedy. It's a global warning, one that is still ticking quietly beneath the surface. When most people think about nuclear disasters, they imagine the moment of impact, the explosion, the meltdown, the towering plume of radioactive smoke. But the true danger of nuclear power is often not in the blast itself. It lies in what follows. The cleanup that never ends, the lies that stretch for decades, the long-term effects no one can see but everyone can feel. This is what makes KYSHTYM so haunting. Unlike Chernobyl or Fukushima, the victims of Mayak never had a voice. They were studied, ignored, hidden, and buried. Their stories were not officially recorded or honored, but they should be, because their suffering was real and continues to echo through time. What can we learn from this? First, secrecy is the most dangerous form of fallout. When governments hide the truth, people cannot protect themselves. They don't know when to evacuate, when to seek help, or even when to be afraid. The institutions that should keep people safe instead become the architects of silence. And silence kills just as surely as radiation. Second, there is no such thing as a truly contained nuclear disaster. The radioactive cloud from Mayak spread hundreds of kilometers. The Teka River carried poisons through entire ecosystems. Windstorms lifted radioactive dust from Lake Karachay and scattered it over populated lands. Radiation doesn't obey fences, borders, or governments. It drifts, invisible and persistent. Third, the human cost is incalculable. Beyond the grim statistics, death tolls, cancer rates, birth defects, are the shattered families, the abandoned villages, the future stolen before they had a chance to begin. Children born sick with no explanation, communities living in fear, and generations poisoned at their roots. This is the real tragedy, the one official reports fail to capture. And yet, this isn't only a story from the past. The same failures that allowed Mayak to happen still exist today. Lack of transparency, political denial, and underfunded oversight plague nuclear programs worldwide. There are currently over 400 nuclear reactors operating across the globe, with dozens more being built. The waste they produce does not disappear. It must be stored, managed, and guarded for centuries. Most nuclear waste sits in temporary storage facilities that are vulnerable to leaks, sabotage, or natural disasters. The cleanup from past disasters is still ongoing. Fukushima's melted reactors will take decades to dismantle. Chernobyl requires constant maintenance to prevent further catastrophe. And Mayak, it continues to leak. Are we truly better prepared now than we were in 1957? Are we ready to face the truth before the next disaster strikes? Because history tells us there will be a next time. It may not be an explosion like Mayak's. It might be a slow leak, a missed warning, a failed safety system. Could happen anywhere, in your country, your city, or even your own backyard. But if we are willing to face the truth, if we confront the reality of nuclear risk, there is still hope. Nuclear technology itself is not evil. It powers hospitals, fuels spacecraft, and has the potential to help solve the global energy crisis. But this technology demands respect and responsibility. It demands transparency in how it is managed, safety in how it is operated, and accountability when things go wrong. The first step is radical openness. No more secrets, no more redacted reports. Every incident, every leak, every risk should be public knowledge, not buried, spun, or politicized. Independent oversight is crucial. Regulatory bodies must be free from political interference, dedicated solely to protecting people, not programs or profits. Whistleblowers, those brave individuals who risk everything to expose hidden dangers, must be protected and celebrated, not punished and silenced. Their courage saved lives in the past and can save many more in the future. International cooperation is also essential. Radiation does not recognize national borders. A leak in one country can affect millions across the globe. Only through global accountability and shared responsibility can we prevent disasters from becoming catastrophes. And finally, justice must be served for the forgotten. The victims of Mayak and other hidden nuclear disasters deserve more than medals or silence. They deserve full recognition, proper compensation, and healing for their wounds that time cannot erase. Most importantly, we must never forget. Forgetting is how history repeats itself. For decades, the name KWSH was a ghost, spoken in whispers, erased from textbooks, scrubbed off maps. But today, you know it. You have heard the voices, seen the scars, and understood what was lost. Now you can help keep this memory alive. In a world flooded with fleeting content and endless noise, choosing to remember is an act of rebellion. Sharing this story is more than just spreading information. It is honoring the lives lost and demanding a better future. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, share it. Not for clicks or outrage, but because somewhere, someone may still be living in a ghost zone, unaware of the danger that surrounds them. Together, we can break the silence. We can honor the forgotten. We can build a future that remembers the cost of lies. Because history only repeats itself when we allow it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please subscribe to the channel. We bring you the hidden histories that others don't want you to know, told with facts, depth, and respect. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and tell us if there are other forgotten stories you want us to explore. Remember, truth buried is truth that festers. Let's bring it into the light.